The Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 80.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray, and today, one of my favorite guests, Markham Hislop from the AmericanEnergyNews.com comes on, and we talk about Venezuela and Canada. And it kind of seems like an odd combination there, but actually, what's going on in Venezuela could have a significant impact on Canada and their oil production and selling oil to the U.S. Markham comes on to break that down for us. He also wrote an article, which we will link to in the show notes, discussing this very topic. And so it's our monthly Markham on Energy segment. And so without further ado, Markham Hislop. Well, Markham, it's good to have you back on for your, your monthly segment now. And, we released the stats from July, and obviously you were a big contributor, and so we appreciate you. And how are you doing today up in Canada?
Oh, I'm just fine, Ryan. Thank you very much. And how are things down in Texas?
Good. We actually had a nice rainstorm last night, so it kind of cooled off the temperatures today, and not as hot as it normally is, and so it's bearable for once. And we're excited about that. So let's get into it. There's a lot of talk in the news about Venezuela. We've covered it a little bit here on the podcast, but you wrote an interesting piece talking about how it could impact Canada. What's going on, and what's the correlation and relation between what's going on in Venezuela and what's going on in Canada as far as oil production goes?
Venezuela produces about 700 to 800,000 barrels a day, and a lot of that is heavy crude, and most of it is sold to American Gulf Coast refineries, and that basically is the same market that the Alberta oil sands wants to get into, because it also generates heavy crude. And the Keystone XL pipeline is, I was just looking, we ran a story today that the siting, or the route approval is the last hurdle. And it appears that TransCanada is going to be able to get enough suppliers. There was a little question about that a couple, 3 weeks ago, whether or not there would be enough supply to justify building the pipeline, but it appears now that that is the case. So what that means is, I think it's 890,000 barrels a day of Alberta oil, mostly Alberta oil sands crude, will be heading down to the Gulf Coast refineries looking for a market. And that could be just about the time that the troubles in Venezuela cut back any, maybe stop altogether or reduce the amount of heavy crude that's coming out of that country.
Okay, and so just from our listeners' perspective, if you look at increasing oil production, is that something that the oil sands can ramp up to meet the demand pretty quickly, or does it take a long lead to kind of get to match that production that we're getting from Venezuela?
The oil sands is different than shale for sure. And mines, there are two types of production. One is you mine the bitumen, which is oil mixed up with clay and sand. It's very gooey. It's about the consistency of peanut butter. And so you mine it, and that accounts for about 48% of all the production in the oil sands. And those obviously take much longer to ramp up. Probably, I don't know what the lead time would be, but the 200,000 barrels a day production that's slated to come on stream in 2017, all of that got started well before the price collapse of 2014. So I think that gives you a little bit of an idea what the lead times are for the oil sands mines. Now on the SAGD side, the steam-assisted gravity drainage side, that looks a lot more like traditional horizontal horizontal wells. You need two of them, one for steam and one to catch to pump the oil up to the surface. But those can be done relatively more quickly, and especially if it's an expansion of an existing facility rather than a greenfield kind of development. So it's not like the oil sands, though, has to ramp up for those 890,000 barrels a day. There's 200 coming online now. The pipeline network out of Canada down to the U.S. is already near or past capacity, and a lot of producers are having to ship their excess or more than what can be accommodated in the pipelines by rail. So there is a fair amount of oil that's available to fill up the Keystone XL, and the amount Keystone XL itself would just about replace all of the Venezuelan heavy crude if it turns out that Venezuela is bumped out of the market.
Okay, well, you brought up a lot of different angles there that are kind of curious to me. And so the first thing you said is that the pipeline capacity is max or over max right now. So what does that look like? Because, this Venezuela deal, it could be a deal where it could be a long-term type situation where the government gets entrenched and they go, okay, you know what, these sanctions could be in place for years and years and years, or it could fall pretty rapidly. So do you think a pipeline company will come in and try to fill this void, or is it a little bit too risky right now to go ahead and start? Because as we know, these cross-country pipelines just take a long time to permit and to get approved. So what do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think there's a very good chance that the Keystone XL is going to get built. I think there's still going to be a lot of opposition to it, but I don't think there's going to be any trouble, filling it up. And down in the Gulf Coast refineries, there are 3 or 4 major suppliers. Canada only has about 10% of the market right now, and the others are Venezuela, of course, and Mexican Maya, and Nigeria, and all of those countries have got trouble with their oil production. Their heavy has been in slow decline for a long time now, and Nigeria has trouble with terrorists or rebels, I guess, that continue to blow up facilities and pipelines. They've been able to maintain production pretty well so far, but it's not a steady and reliable source the way the oil sands would be. So there's a real market opportunity for Canadian producers to get down into the Gulf Coast and be seen as a competitive, stable source of supply and squeeze out some of those countries I just talked about. And if Venezuela, if their output drops significantly or entirely because of what's going on in the country, well, then Canada might be in a position to supply all of that, all of the oil that Venezuela currently supplies.
Well, obviously, the Trump administration has pushed an America First agenda in energy, but also there's been some side effects from that, such as partnering with countries like Canada that are more friendly to the U.S., that are more stable, that they're going to be work out better deals with us. If the Venezuela deal goes away, you could look at it and say, well, if Venezuela falls off the market, Canada could actually get maybe a long-term deal if the prices can be competitive. And that's kind of my question is, why is the U.S. buying from Venezuela currently? Is it that much cheaper than buying from Canada, or what's going on that makes Canada not competitive in the market right now?
I don't think it's a question of being, but it may be, let me take that back. It may be a question of competitiveness because crude oil by rail or getting the oil down to the Gulf Coast by the existing pipeline is more expensive than the Keystone XL will be. So with Keystone XL, I don't know how many dollars it'll lop off the transportation tolls, but maybe could be $5 or $6, and that might be just enough to make the oil much more competitive. The other thing that the Canadian oil sands producers are doing is they're doing a version of what the Texas shale producers have been doing now for the last couple of years, and that's introducing new technology to drive down costs. We've heard a lot of talk about that over the last 6 months or so. And in the case of the oil sands producers, and I think we talked about this on the last interview, on the SAGD side, where they can shave possibly as much as 30% of their costs, is getting rid of the natural gas that they use to create steam, which they pump into the reservoir to loosen up the bitumen and make it flow. So if they use a light hydrocarbon or like as a solvent to dissolve it instead of heat it, then there's an opportunity there to significantly bring down those costs and to be more competitive in the Gulf Coast. So, in fact, I was talking to Kevin Byrne from IHS not long ago. He's kind of the oil sands market expert up in Calgary, and he was telling me that a lot of the producers now have got their cash costs down to about $30 a barrel.
Oh, wow.
And so at $50 oil, the Canadian producers can be pretty competitive.
No, absolutely. That's good to hear because if you look at it and say, well, the market doesn't look like it's having big upswings anytime soon. It's going to stay 50 or go lower. That's good to know that Canada can supply a good, steady product at that price. And if the pipeline does get built, as you mentioned, that's good because I think a lot of things that we've kind of talked about on the show, and even when you've been on here, is you look at geopolitics. I think what we're going to see over the next 5-10 years is with the shale revolution is the U.S. and other countries trying to make deals with countries that align with their interests and not having to make deals with countries that don't align with their interests. And so this could be a long-term partnership. Obviously, the U.S. and Canada get along just about as well as you can, I would think. And as we talked last time, you have you have the Socialist Party that's doing stuff, but you have big oil that seems to be working with the government there. And maybe there's some lessons that we can learn here in the U.S. on how big oil and government can work together here.
I'm sure there are. One of the things I'd like to point out is that President Trump has put a bit of the fear of God into the Canadian oil and gas sector, because what Trump has now triggered the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement. Right. That makes people really nervous. They're really worried that there's going to be some kind of restrictions on energy flows between the two countries. And he was also at one time, you'll remember around the tax reform, he was talking about less him, but a lot of the other Republicans in Congress were talking about a border tax. And a border adjustment tax. Right. And that would have added, according to the economists that I interviewed about that could add 15 to 20% to any imports that come into the U.S., including imports from Canada. So, and that hasn't gone away. And so when I interview people from the Canadian industry and economists and so on that interface with the industry all the time, one of the things that they say is, look, all of our oil goes to the U.S. We need to diversify our markets. We need to get the Kinder Morgan pipeline built to the West Coast so we can, send 500,000 barrels a day over to China or India. So President Trump has spooked Canadians a little bit with being as aggressive as he is, and I don't know how that's going to play out, but that's sort of an underlying theme. I'm sure that'll come up during the NAFTA negotiations.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up because my understanding, I had to go back and look at that piece of legislation because it's been a little while since I've thought much about it. But my understanding was that would not apply to Canada and Mexico. But I could be wrong about that. I haven't looked at it in I don't know 2-3 months now, and so that kind of slips to mind. But for some reason, I thought that was for non-North American countries for the most part. The import on oil, the tariff, and that was to keep out Middle East oil and stuff like that. But again, don't quote me on that. But that would be interesting if he did that. Now, one thing I think we've learned about President Trump is he's positioning himself to make a deal, whether you agree with his way he does it or not. And so, I was actually surprised he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement because it seemed like that was going to be one of the deals where he talked about it, and didn't do it, and then he actually did do it. So I'm not really sure what he's going to do on some of these things. It's kind of hard to gauge how much is hyperbole and how much he's actually going to follow through with.
Well, see, that's from working in the oil industry, one of the things that the industry likes is stability. And so his rhetoric around that kind of stuff makes people nervous. Now, right. It may be that once the NAFTA negotiations begin, and depending on what he says over the next 3 to 6 months, maybe 12 months, he might reassure people, and they might be less nervous than they are now. But that is an issue up in the Calgary head offices for the oil and gas companies.
Well, it'll be interesting to follow, but this Venezuela stuff and what's going on there, it's just feels so bad for the people of Venezuela that they're having to go through this. It's just a terrible situation. But there is an economic side in oil and gas, and I wanted to get your opinion on it because you've covered it and you know this Canada market as good as anyone. And so the AmericanEnergyNews.com is where they can find you, and Markham on Energy. And anything else that you want to plug or promote before we get you out of here today?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to chat with you, Ryan, and we'll look forward to next month.
All right. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes for the listeners, and thanks again, Markham.
Yeah, take care, Ryan.
The Global Energy Leaders Podcast is produced by Michael Sims and Chris Prine. Chris Prine also serves as editor for the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.